Okay, good evening, everyone. Nice to see you all. Thank you all for coming. It's great to see everyone turn out this evening. I have my phone up here to remind you all to silence your phones. Ah, nice. So my name is Mary Ellen Delastrito. I am the president of the AAUW Salem branch. And I want to welcome you for coming to our ballot measure forum this evening. I'm excited to see so many of you this evening. I'm going to tell you a little bit about AAUW and about our partnership here. So AAUW is a national organization that has state-level organizations and local branches. And so, as I mentioned, I'm from the Salem branch. And AAUW advances equity for women and girls through advocacy, education, philanthropy, and research. And one of our local Salem branch goals is to educate the community on public policy issues that relate to women and girls. And voting, of course, is a central tenet to public policy tonight. That's why we're here. The democratic process is very important. Now, AAUW Salem branch has a very long-standing collaboration with the League of Women Voters. And for many years, and we think it's about 5 at least, we've been collaborating with and co-programming with the League of Women Voters on public policy events like this during the month of October. So I'm really glad to be here at another one of those collaborative events with our 2 organizations. It's very important for us as a community organization to be involved in understanding what's happening in our government. It's also very important that we are informed voters. And so that's why we're really excited to be a part of this event tonight, to learn about all of our statewide ballot measures. So I'm going to now pass the mic off to my counterpart in the League of Women Voters, Diana.
I'm Diana Bodker, and I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Marion and Polk counties. And as she has explained how AAUW works, we are at the local level, we're at the state level, and the national level. And so we're here tonight with AAUW to talk, of course, about the ballot measures. And the history of the League of Women Voters, briefly, is that the League of Women Voters was begun in anticipation of women getting the right to vote. And so we are right at the time when that was being set up. And so we will celebrate our 100th anniversary in 2020. We will be 100 years old at that time. And the purpose was, here are women being able to vote for the first time on the national level, and it was thought that education was necessary. Women wanted to know, well, what do I need to do in this democratic process? And so it was set up so that we can educate ourselves and also the public in an unbiased manner. And so tonight we are simply going to present the issues regardless of whether the League has a position on a particular one of the ballot measures. Well, that will not be presented. We will simply present in an unbiased fashion. We'd like to thank CCTV for recording the program this evening and getting that out to the larger public. And we have 2 runners. Where are our runners? There's one back there, and where's our other runner? We have 2 runners, and they will have pencils and paper. So when you think of a question, while Deanie and I are presenting, you just hold up your hand, and they'll run down to you with a pencil and a card or whatever to write on. And then at the end, we do every effort to answer any questions you may have that our little presentation has not helped you with. So that I just, again, as she said, I am so pleased to see so many of you here, and don't forget to vote. That is what is so important for our democracy, is for all of us to vote. So thank you.
Tonight, I wanted to also extend the discussion about education versus advocacy, because for a lot of people, it's confusing to see League of Women Voters wear two hats. So I want to emphasize again that this is the education element, the unbiased, pro and con, and that is reflected in the voters' guides that you can find out on the information table. So I hope if you haven't picked one of those up that you will do so, or if you have a neighbor or someone else to share that with, please note they are also in Spanish. And later on you'll see a website that will allow you to also view it online if you would like to do so. As we prepare, it's important to realize that one of the headers, I think, to voting is to understand some of the vocabulary that's out there that you are faced with as a voter. One of those is in looking at whether something is constitutional or statutory. So if we look at statutory first, then we're reminded that statutory means that it is empowered by the legislature, that they will have an opportunity to finesse it. So if the measure passes and it gets to them and they discover that it's in conflict with prior legislation, then they will be able to enact it. However, if it's constitutional amendment, then it needs to come back to the voters, and the legislature cannot tinker with it at all. So it's very important as you look at each of these measures that you kind of keep that in mind. It was easier to get a statutory measure on the ballot. It took fewer signatures. So just to note a difference. Again, constitutional took more signatures, and again, they can't tinker with it. It will have to be referred back to you. There are 5 state measures that have qualified for the November general election ballots. And I would like to make sure that you know what each one is in terms of the statutory and the constitutional. Measure 102, municipal bonds for affordable housing. This was referred from the legislature, and it amends the Constitution. So we're looking at constitutional amendment. Measure 103 bans taxes on groceries. And this is also a constitutional amendment brought to you by initiative petition. So we've got initiative petition, we have legislative referral, we have statutory amendment, and we have constitutional amendment. All terms that you want to see how they apply to the measures. The other thing I wanted to say is the titles for these are determined by Secretary of State's office, not by League of Women Voters or public. So, and there's a lot of going back and forth between the petitioners and the Secretary of State's office as to qualifying titles as well. Measure 104 is referred to as a supermajority for revenue changes. This is an amendment to the Constitution brought to you by initiative petition. Measure 105, called Sanctuary State, is referred by initiative petition, and this one is a statutory amendment. Measure 106 is by titled Stop Taxpayer Funding for Abortion. This is an initiative petition, and it is a constitutional amendment. To let you know how the material came into what we will be using tonight and what you see online and in the voters' guides on the information table, there are researchers that are league members, sometimes one, sometimes as a team, and they research the ballot measure. They go to Secretary of State's office. They contact the initiators of the petition. They look at pro and con support, and there's at least 3 drafts that go back and forth. And then we have a team of editors. Diana and I were each an editor, and there were 2 others. And then we look to see, does it flow, does it make sense, is there errors, are there things that we don't understand? We send it back to the pro-con people and to the researchers. So it has gone through quite a lot of vetting to arrive to you. So I hope you find that valuable. Diana at this time is going to begin with Measure 102. And again, I'd like to remind you, raise your hands high if any time during the program you would like a card to write a question upon, and then the runners will come back to you when you raise your hand and pick it up. And as Diana said, we'll do our best to answer. And what we can't answer, then we send those right back to the researchers and say, find this out. And then we will post it on our website, and you can check there for the answer. So Diana, would you like to begin with 102?
All right. Measure 102 amends the Constitution, as Deanie said, and it allows cities and counties to use bonds to fund privately owned affordable housing. There is no financial impact to state or local revenues or expenses, and it depends on local government decisions. All right. Supporters say it allows more local affordable housing to be built. It allows the use of bond dollars in partnership with nonprofit and private housing providers. And just as a side note, today there was quite an extensive article that started on the front page of the Statesman about this particular measure and talking about how affordable housing would be built with this. The opponents say, well, first, there's no organized opposition to it. It doesn't mean there aren't opponents, but there's no organized opposition. They say the Constitution should not be amended lightly. They say that the state could use bond money for projects of more widespread benefit.
Measure 103, with the title of banning taxes on groceries, has the official title of amending the Constitution, prohibiting taxes and fees is kind of an important word in this one, so as you're looking at it, that's kind of the important word. Based on transactions for groceries, that's another definition you'll need to know, what constitutes groceries, and this will be enacted or amended after September 2017, so you'll notice that that's retroactive. The financial impact, the Secretary of State has determined that the financial impact is indeterminate, although it constrains the future revenue options and that a government like Oregon's might consider. So, in other words, they don't really know. As we look at the possible results of a yes vote, what would it do? If it passes, it amends the Oregon Constitution to prohibit state or local taxes or fees based on transactions for groceries. So I'm going to interrupt that and give us a definition of groceries, since we're going to hear that so much. It is specifically the sale of raw or processed food or beverage intended for human consumption at all stages of using that food. This includes agricultural crops and food and beverage products of all types, whether those products are in the warehouses, in transit, in packaging, in processing plants, restaurants, or other locations. The other location isn't your home unless you're packaging it up to sell. So that's our definition of groceries. So the results of a no vote: if this measure fails, state and local governments retain the authority to enact or amend taxes, including the corporate minimum tax. So you'll remember that measure from our previous election. Fees or transactions for groceries, including on sellers and distributors. So the way it is now, and this is an important one for us to remember, that currently there's no sales tax on groceries in Oregon. The only sales tax there is on the foods. If you've traveled to see the Shakespearean Festival, you get a tax in Ashland. And there is one like that in Yachats as well. If you've gone to their music festival, you've encountered those taxes in both of those kind of situations. So the impact of this one would really be felt on those two locations, and they would have to retain their limit and reapply. So that's the way it is at this moment. This brings a new section to Article 9 of the Oregon Constitution, prohibiting the state or any local government from adopting, approving, or enacting after that October 2017 time, any tax, any fee, or any other assessment on the transaction of those groceries. Now, if you were a supporter of this, you would say it falls on the people least able to afford it. You would also say that it removes the burden on grocery and industry relative to corporate minimum tax. It prevents tax on sodas and sugar beverages, because those would be constituting food, and so that's a variable there. If you were an opponent to this measure, you would say that no tax on groceries is proposed, and so it's unnecessary. This goes back to the statement that we currently don't have a sales tax. It's too broad as it applies to the whole food chain. So remember, we talked about all of the different elements involved in getting food from source to retail. It may be misleading. The grocery industry is interested in their profit margins. So this is what the opponents would say about Measure 103.
All right. The next measure is Measure 104. Now, this amends the Constitution and defining raising revenue by a 3/5 vote requirement. Now, this is something that has not, we have had this to raise taxes, but this is covering all forms of revenue. It has been decided that it has an indeterminate financial impact. We're not really sure what this would do. So that part we don't know. We really don't know what impact this would have. And certainly you see a lot of ads on TV about this one right now. The probable result of a yes vote is that it would require a 3/5 legislative majority vote, which is already, as I said, required to raise taxes, to pass any bill that would raise state revenue, including tax exemptions, deductions, and credits, as well as fee changes. Now, it's important to remember that this is not only to raise them, but to change them in any way, which is just a sidelight of this problem, of this particular motion. If this measure fails, the current interpretation of the existing law on raising revenue would remain in effect, requiring a 3/5 majority only for bills that would levy new taxes or increase existing taxes. So currently what we have, as I said before, is that the current law requires an approval of 3/5 of each legislative house to pass a bill to raise taxes. And that has been there since 1996. The proposal, if passed, Measure 104 would amend Article 4, Section 25 of the Oregon's Constitution to require a 3/5 vote of both the House and the Senate to pass bills that not only raise revenue through new or increased taxes, but also on any bill that raises fees, the state charges, and any bills that change other taxes.
Supporters say the legislature is too partisan and tax reliant to reduce taxes and fees. I thought it was interesting that in terms of fees, I didn't know what was out there, and I found that there are 24,000 fees levied in Oregon. Hunting, fishing licenses, vehicle and vessel registrations like boats, firearms, background checks, all of that. So that's what fees are. That's another one of those definitions we should know. Supporters also say that it should apply to all increases in taxes or fees. And they also say it should not be easy to raise fees. The opponents to this measure state it would create gridlock to vote on every fee. They also say that it would prevent specific projects like parks from keeping up with the costs. In addition, they would say it would make it harder to eliminate the perks and the loopholes used by special interests. This is ballot measure 104.
All right, our next one is ballot measure 105. And this, as Deanie had said earlier, this is a statutory amendment. And there was not time, apparently, before the election to determine the fiscal impact. It would repeal ORS section, I'm sorry, I don't have the number, making it illegal for a state, county, or city public official to refuse to assist federal immigration authorities.
I was looking to see if I could see that. I don't see what number it is.
We don't have that, that's right. All right. So the probable results of a yes vote, in other words, what would this measure do? It repeals the laws limiting, with exceptions, the use of state and local law enforcement resources for detecting, apprehending persons suspected only of violating federal immigration laws. So that would repeal that, which is what we've had now and had for many years. A no vote retains the laws limiting, with exceptions, the use of state and local law enforcement resources for detecting, apprehending persons suspected only of violating federal immigration laws. In other words, it simply repeals. It would repeal that, and a no vote would leave it as it stands now. So we have been a sanctuary state since 1987. We were the first state in the Union to be that. And as you noticed, if you had an opportunity to read this in the paper or somewhere else, you've seen that there's quite a split between certain sheriffs of certain counties and of other counties about whether this is good or bad. But this is certainly a contested state, a contested measure.
In Marion County, just since that's where we are, Marion County, the Salem Area Police Sheriff's Office and our DA, as well as the Polk County DA, have not taken a stand on it. And the numbers of the police legal people, that's 20% of that total police security people that we have. So since we're in Marion County, some of you may have come from Polk County, just to let you know the stand of our local people.
That's right. Okay. And as you know, this has been certainly something that has been talked about a great deal over the time. And there was the Oregon's first sanctuary law came about because a lawsuit was brought by a U.S. citizen of Mexican descent and who was interrogated and humiliated in a restaurant in Independence in 1977. And his attorney, Rocky Barilla, was later as the first Hispanic member of the Oregon legislature, and he introduced a bill, this sanctuary bill, and we have had it ever since. And it passed with great majorities in both the House and in the Senate.
Okay, if you were a supporter, you would say if people come to this country, they should not break laws to do so. If you were a supporter, you would say because they're undocumented immigrants would accept substandard wages, they undermine the employment of legal workers. You might also say that the sanctuary law has kept Oregon state and local law enforcement agencies from being able to offer their fullest cooperation in the to the U.S. authorities. that are charged with identifying and detaining illegal immigrants. Undocumented immigrants, and this is what has been emphasized in a lot of the papers and the articles, commit other crimes. Now, those in opposition would state that the passage of this measure could open the door to widespread racial profiling, separation of families, and generate fear in even the documented immigrants who might be perceived as being undocumented. Undocumented immigrants work and pay taxes. Passage of this measure would reduce the labor force in Oregon, especially in the areas of construction and in agriculture. And then the statistics that have been developed from a variety of sources show that immigrants are less likely to commit crimes than U.S.-born people. But passage of this measure would frighten the immigrants and prevent them from reporting the crimes or cooperating with local police. The story that is used in this one is in Woodburn. A young girl, there were people coming into her home, and the family was being, the parents were being drugged out by federal officials, and she didn't know what to do, so she called her local police that she had confidence in and reported, and they came, and everybody, all the officials at all levels sorted it out. So that's the story that goes along with that particular element. It's important to know Oregon was the first sanctuary state in the U.S., and we have some other data if you need others. In this one, I wanted to emphasize again the vocabulary. You have words such as immigrant, you have words documented, undocumented, you hear refugee. So this is another one where the terms are important for you to have an understanding about.
The next measure is Ballot Measure 106, and this is the official title is Stop Taxpayer Funding for Abortion, and it would prohibit public funds from being spent on abortions. This would amend the Constitution, and so this is a measure that was referred to the ballot by initiative petition by 100,000 plus signatures. The probable results of a yes vote, in other words, what would this measure do if it does pass? It means the state would be prohibited from spending public funds directly or indirectly, for example, health insurance plans that cover abortion, with exceptions only for pregnancies resulting from rape or incest, or for an abortion to terminate an ectopic pregnancy or to prevent death of a pregnant woman. This measure would reduce abortion access for low-income women and publicly employed women. It has not yet been determined whether the measure would restrict funding for contraceptives or the so-called morning after pill. The probable results of a no vote is that the current law would be retained. It places no restrictions on spending public funds for health care plans covering abortion or for abortions approved by a medical professional. So this, we have had in our state since Roe v. Wade, we have had, of course, the ability for a woman to have an abortion, and then, yeah, why don't you go ahead and go through that? There you go.
We discovered in reading what they wrote that we needed to rearrange it in a timeline order to understand all the dates and the numbers. So in 1969, the Oregon legislature had a protect the right to abortion, but it had some restrictions. In 1973, Roe versus Wade, abortions were legal nationally, and there were restrictions, as Diana has stated. In 1978, a measure in Oregon to restrict state funding, so this is 1978, came up, and it failed by 52%. In 1983, Oregon repealed the restrictions, and so those were some of the things that she listed about rape, incest, and ectopic pregnancies. In 1986, a measure came again to restrict state funding, and this time it failed at 55%. And in 2017, the Reproductive Health Equity Law was signed by the governor, which was addressed to insurers. It did have restrictions. The federal law was still in place, and this was put into place without a vote because it was considered emergency health. So that brings us up to the measure that you are faced with on the ballot measure this time.
All right. All right. Supporters say that the taxpayer should not pay, that it violates personal and religious beliefs, that it doesn't stop abortion, it simply prevents public funds for paying for them. And that also women carry emotional scars from having abortions. Opponents say restricting access to abortion is not in keeping with Oregon values. Women should be able to choose. That it takes away coverage on the Oregon Health Plan, as well as from state employees like teachers, nurses, firefighters. That it will cause severe consequences to low-income women. And there is one thing that has not been completely determined about this, and that is how much it would impact the state workers. I believe that the original petitioners were not considering that aspect of it, and so that may have to be resolved in the courts.
There are a couple of questions that have come up in our other presentations on this measure, so I'd like to go ahead and address those because I don't think it was changed in the printed voter's guide. It is altered on the online version. One is that the public money will still be used when federal law requires states to pay in cases of rape, incest, and ectopic pregnancies. So under federal law, no matter what this measure does, there would still be some that would be paid for. And at the time it was the voter's guide was printed, we did not have information about the financial impact. And one of the questions people ask is how much is spent annually already for abortions in our state? So the Secretary of State Financial Impact Committee added to and did determine those. $2.9 million for abortions annually. If the measure passes, the state will save that $2.9 million, but it is anticipated that the passage of the measure will result in expenditures of an increase of $22 million to pay for the services of health care, birthing, food, nutrition services that are provided by other state government programs. There's a net cost increase of $19.3 million in the first year. The initiative impact is also expected to increase annual corresponding federal revenue that's received by our state, and the anticipated number getting from the federal would be 14.5. So if you do some subtraction there, you find that that leaves the state with $4.8 million in increased expenditures in that first year, which is suggested that it will compound over future years. So that might help you with that question that has come up in other situations. Okay, I'd like to remind you all, please, if you have questions, to make sure our runners get those, and they will have or have been sorting them, looking for duplicates, and then we will begin with those questions, and we'll do the best we can. And as I said before, what we can answer, we'll send back to Secretary of State or to our researchers. Till we get. So, runners, do you have some questions that we can take, please?
This particular question is, It's on.
It's on.
It's on. If a constitutional amendment passes, what is the process to remove that amendment from the Constitution if the amendment is later found to be most unusable? I think that's what it says, is unusable. Okay. Well, we would have to have another process of voting in repealing that. That's the only way once it's in the Constitution, that's what we would have to do. So it's quite an involved process, but.
It could be brought to you by legislative referral.
Yes.
It would be so the legislature would determine that they can't use it, they don't know how to, they can't fix it. That's not their job, they don't have that right. But they would find that it's in conflict with something else, or they cannot implement it. So they would do a legislative referral that would then come out to be on the ballot, and then you would get to vote on it. So that's how it would eventually get to us. What is the definition of affordable housing? This is a two-part one, and I'm going to look that one up because there are several, so I'll share those with you. How do voters know that the housing remains affordable after construction is complete? We have two answers to part two. One of those is that it is a contract. So if they're in violation of the contract, then that's like any contract. They would have to suffer the penalties of voiding the contract. The other element to keep in mind is, since it would be a bond measure, you as voters would be choosing whether to vote for that bond measure utilizing those players in that bond measure. So if you didn't like business X that's listed in the bond measure, then you would have probably not voted on that. So you retain local control, as we do now with any bond measure. So there's legal constraints and there's local voter control through voting. Do you have something else? I'm going to look up this first definition, and you can go to another question if you want, and I'll look it up.
All right, you have the questions there.
I'll get back to you on this one. I have several.
Okay. This question is about Measure 105, about our sanctuary state. It says, who pays the costs of our local police when assisting the federal authorities? The state of Oregon, local authorities, or the federal government? I believe it would be, and I hope I'm right, I believe it would be whatever, if they're county sheriff, or it would be the county. If it was the city of Salem, it would be the city. I believe that is how that is covered. So they are simply assisting the federal authorities. What is the majority, this is on ballot measure 104, what is the majority vote requirement currently? And that is that for all new taxes, that it has to be 3/5 majority. And that on 104, is that correct, Deanie?
Yes,
Yeah.
3/5. Oh, they don't, that isn't true for, sorry.
Mike?
The 3/5 doesn't currently apply to the fees, and that's what makes this measure significant, and I think that's why the statement comes up that some people feel that it would create gridlock if you had to vote and get 3/5 supermajority on every one of those 24,000 fees.
What is it now? What's that?
Right now, it just, yeah. Okay, I'm going to go back to that definition of affordable housing. And the basic thing I would say about the definition is it is influenced by what different communities, state, local, national, call low income. And that varies somewhere between 40 to 60% of median salary, medium income. And so part of the definition of affordable housing will be determined by what is median income, and then that jurisdiction will say, well, we're going to call affordable housing that you're an applicant if you have 40% of that median, or we're going to say it's 60%. So that influences the definition. It's not explicitly defined in the ballot measures, and so that's going to leave it up to local governments when they're putting out the bond to put that definition in there, or at least they should. And I think that that's the biggest thing to keep in mind, that basically there's no certain definition that's applied at all levels of what affordable housing is. It's going to be determined by local jurisdiction, and it's going to be determined by that area's median income, and it will be determined by what percent that jurisdiction decides to apply to that median income. This one is also Measure 102. Let's see. It says, who winds up owning and being responsible for the housing, especially when done in conjunction with private developers? This isn't stated in the measure either. Currently, about 60% of affordable housing in areas is monitored by housing authorities and nonprofits. So I don't know, I guess it depends on how that bond in that local community is written, but currently about 60% of affordable housing is monitored by housing authorities and nonprofits. So that is, but keep in mind again that it is a contract, and so they would have to monitor, the local jurisdiction would have to monitor it to keep, that they're keeping to the contract. That's the best I can do on that one. 104, Measure 104, or did you have one you wanted to do? Okay, here's another 102. We'll come back to this 104 one in just a moment.
No, I think that the one I wanted to hit here was, who are the largest funders of Measure 103? That's the no taxes on groceries. And so it is the major funders are like Kroger and Safeway. And I believe the one I had heard recently on the radio.
Costco.
And Costco, that's right. And also the people who make soda pop. With concerns about, possible, as you know, across the country, some cities are saying that they put a tax on soda pop for health reasons. So, do you know this, what about this one?
Are these done ones?
Yeah, what about this one? What about October 17th on 103? Do you know that one?
Why did the petitioners choose October 1st? I haven't seen anything that listed why it's retroactive back to after September, therefore making it October 1st. That's an interesting question, and I don't know the answer to that, because I haven't seen anything. I don't know whether it's a legal thing or they just picked it because it was a month before voting. I don't know. So that's one that we'll star and try to find, but I've not read anything.
On the same issue?
What is the benefit of passing Measure 103 since it's an amendment for a tax that doesn't even exist? Who benefits? Okay, the first part of this question is what is used as an argument against 103, because as the persons for this one, against this one would say that we don't have a sales tax, so is it presumptive to put one into the Constitution when there isn't already when we don't already have anything? So I guess it would be up to you to see if you think that the benefit of passing and having it be a constitutional amendment is something a person might say that they think they want it in place so that if any sales tax comes up, it's already there. Others would say, don't clutter the Constitution with something that doesn't exist. So I would say that that's the argument on both sides of that statement. And who benefits? This is also going to be argumentative and puts us in a bad place. because on both sides, one side would say that it only benefits the grocer corporations that are addressing what's the tax called from 2 years ago? Anyway, I'll look that up. So some would say that that's only benefiting them. Others would say, again, that it's in place to protect the retailers and all of the people involved in groceries. So I think that would be how you would look at benefits from pro and con. And I want to look up this specifically, that measure, and tell you, referred back to it, because that's kind of what pushed this measure into place. And so I have to look that up. So I'll finish that one in a second.
And here's a question. Why would federal funding increase by $14.5 million on the anti-abortion amendment if it were to pass? And I believe it's because this would be funding for low-income children and low-income families, and so those measures would increase funding for these increased number of children in this area. Okay. Got that one?
Okay, Measure 104 is the measure vague enough so that it likely would need judicial review?
104?
Yeah. I don't know personally whether I can, I don't know that I can answer that. That's what happens when we vote measures in. It goes to judicial review, and then we find out. So I'm going to see if I can find anything in here that makes that statement. So I'm looking up two parts. Diana, if you want to
Okay.
go ahead, I'm going to look up these two
All right.
parts.
This question is on the abortion amendment, number 106. Aren't state employees paying for their health care insurance with their own money? Does the state contribute money for the health care insurance? And why couldn't there be a supplemental insurance for abortion paid by individuals? I don't think there's any reason there couldn't be. It's just that's not the way it is now. Who's a state worker here who can answer that question? Thank you.
So currently, I am an employee of Oregon State University, for example, and currently we pay a portion of our health care, but the majority of our health care premiums are paid by our employers, and thus are not paid by the individual. Does that help?
Yes, it does. That helps a lot. Thank you very much.
Corporate minimum tax.
Okay. That's right. That's it. There you go.
Okay, back to the passing of 103 benefits and so forth. This whole thing came about in response to the corporate minimum tax that where corporations decide on one or the other way that they wish to be taxed. And this was at our last election that we voted this in, and that corporations have an opportunity to choose one or the other of the two vehicles to pay their corporate minimum tax. And so the corporations that Diana pointed out came back and are looking for a way to address that. So you might take your thoughts back to that ballot measure and what was involved there, or review that. And that was the prompt for ballot measure 103. I'm looking up the other part about 104. I have a feeling we don't have an answer for it, but I'll look that up.
And I'd just like to remind you about the corporate minimum tax. That argument, if you remember, it's not so long ago, the argument was that the margin was so small in groceries there was such a small margin of profit that this was very difficult. I mean, that was the argument, was that it was very difficult for these grocery stores to deal with.
I'm going to look at ballot measure 104. The question was, is it vague enough so that it would likely need judicial review? I don't actually, they could find something in small details, especially in implementation. That's an oftentimes where that comes into play, is they go ahead to try to implement and they find out, oh, here's this clincher. But the proposal is pretty direct. It says, as it exists now, we have a 3/5 supermajority for those things that are taxes that would raise state revenue, and this includes tax exemptions, but it doesn't include fees. So specifically, ballot measure 104 addresses the addition of requiring the 3/5 majority on fees. So I think it's pretty specific as what it wants its intent to be. Now, the implementation may take it to judicial review.
I think that's right.
I asked that question. What about, for instance,
His story, I'm going to repeat it. He's asking, what about the situation where Parks has to balance its costs of doing cleanup and all the things, and so what will happen with that? And if you noticed on our examples, let's see if this is what the opponents to the measure would say. They would say that it would create a gridlock to vote on every fee, and that it does make it hard for agencies that are addressing immediate budget and costs and projects, that they would be delayed. So that's what opponents would say.
While Deanie's looking at this one, there was a question here earlier, brought up earlier, about concerning Measure 102, which is affordable housing. Affordable housing sounds like something that would benefit our society, but wouldn't developers benefit from this? And so who is funding this? This is not particularly, I mean, it may be funded somewhat, but mostly this is a referral from the legislature. And yes, of course, developers would benefit, but developers always benefit or they wouldn't develop it. So, I mean, that's the reality. If we're not building it with the state itself directly doing it, then the developers are yes, they are going to benefit. There's nothing like the tax ones, right, to get you. That's what she's studying here. And it's on the back side.
Yeah. I'll share this with you, and then I may need to ponder more because, taxes, right? Hard to understand. The statement, and we that have done our taxes realizes that state tax procedures use figures from federal forms. So the person is making this statement and this question. A federal tax break, and that's the key word here, that tax breaks, I'm going to read the background the way it is now, but the key word in this question is the tax break component. So current law requires the approval of 3/5 of each legislative house to pass a bill to raise taxes. Okay, we got that. Now, in 1996, that law was interpreted by legislative council and state courts to apply only to new taxes, increases to an existing tax, and not to fee increases or changes to tax expenditures. Tax expenditures are called tax breaks. So right now, that 3/5 isn't applying to that. So the difference then, if Measure 104 passed, it would then start being applied to tax breaks or tax expenditures. So that's at least part of the answer. I don't think it's the whole answer, because the question then says, what could be the financial impact of this? And so I can't address that part. But the key element to this question is the use of the word tax breaks or tax expenditures. So right now, 3/5 doesn't apply. The measure comes in, it will apply.
I think that's right. Yeah. Do you have any others?
Any other questions? There's lots to think about, and I do encourage you once again to consider the vocabulary that's involved anytime we vote on measures and what we have to look at and what we have to think about. There are more places to get information, and as you think about things more, there are places that you can submit your questions to. So you can, right now, today was, and yesterday and today were our last days for registration. So those changes you can still make, but they won't apply till this election. So you need to turn your ballot in November 6th, and please note that postmarks don't count. So if you're running late with getting it in, you're going to have to drive it in, find a current box to deposit. If you have concerns or needs, please do not hesitate to go to the county office, and they have amazing kinds of help with you. If you've had a relative who has had a stroke and their signature does not look the same any longer, please contact the county elections office, and they will verify it, and that should not keep that person from voting. We encourage you to take a look at the signs that are out there for voter rights. I bet we don't all know all those, so that may help solve some of your registration and voting concerns. Website to go to, if you typed in Vote Oregon, just about everything there is will come up for you. You will see all of the candidate interviews that we have done. You will see a program on Oregon's voting and election processes, which is very interesting. And you will see the voter's guide in Spanish and in English, all available there for you. You also will see the CCTV broadcasts of these House districts and commissioners. You will, we've done that one. And then the big thing is that we find out that sometimes people say they aren't going to vote. One, their vote doesn't matter. Untrue, it does matter. It matters if you don't vote. And also that, oh, well, they don't know all the candidates, they don't understand the ballot measures, so then they can't vote. Well, it's not an all or none. So vote on the things that you want to vote on, read up on the things that you aren't sure of, and then be able to vote on those. And please encourage everybody to not let them use that as an excuse to vote. So once again, we encourage you to take a look at the AUW and the League of Women Voter tables out there, and I think our AUW president will close us off for this evening. Thank you on behalf of League of Women Voters for coming.
I'm impressed with this. Are you impressed? All right, excellent. I'm always very impressed with the amount of work and effort and research that this organization puts into this process, and I'm very thankful that they have the energy, the time, and the brains to do all of this. So thank you so very much for doing that. So one more round of applause. So thank you all for coming because you are the informed voter, and we know that's really, really important. And we hope that you will share the materials that you received here so that other folks can be informed voters. And I will reiterate this idea that, you don't have to vote on every single candidate, but vote for what you can. And what's most important is that you participate and that you get your friends and family and coworkers and people around you excited about participating and voting this year. So thank you very much, and make sure you talk with both organizations out in the lobby as we close out the evening. Thanks.
Thank you.